Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today we're plunging into Sayyid's incredibly thought-provoking book, Recalling the Caliphate, Decolonization and World Order.
It's a really powerful piece of work.
Absolutely. And our mission with this deep dive for you is to challenge and, unpack some of those deeply ingrained assumptions we all hold, assumptions about identity, about power, and the global order, especially when it comes to the complex relationship between the West and Islam.
Exactly. Sayyid argues that decolonization isn't just some abstract theoretical concept. He presents it as like a living, evolving practice.
Right.
And it's deeply informed by a critical look at Muslim experiences and perspectives. It's really about revealing how different narratives compete for dominance in shaping our world.
Often in ways we don't even realize.
Precisely, often subtly.
And right from the start, Sayyid throws a fascinating curveball. Something about, something we all think we understand, identity. What's the core idea he introduces there?
What's truly fascinating is his immediate dive into the relational nature of identity. Identity isn't some fixed independent quality.
Okay.
It's inherently relational and contrastive. It fundamentally rests on difference.
Okay, let's unpack this because this feels pivotal. He's saying identity isn't just about who we are in isolation, but how we define ourselves in relation to others.
Exactly.
And that very act of differentiation, that can be the source of tension itself. It's not just ignorance or malice.
That's right. He argues that antagonism is actually constitutive of identity.
Constitutive?
Yeah, meaning antagonism isn't just some regrettable byproduct of interaction. It's a fundamental aspect of how identities are formed in the first place.
So the challenge then, according to Sayyid, isn't to somehow erase antagonism.
Which is likely impossible anyway.
Right, but rather to domesticate it, to manage it within some kind of framework.
That's the idea, to bring it within a set of rules or norms.
That's a powerful and, pretty counterintuitive idea. And this relational understanding of identity, surprisingly perhaps, leads us directly into his critique of secularism. We're often told, that secularism is this universally beneficial concept. It fosters civic peace, harmony, keeps religion private.
Yeah, the standard arguments. It's presented as this cornerstone of modern peaceful society, preventing appeals to, supernatural forces from derailing public debate.
But Sayyid pushes back on that narrative, doesn't he? How does he see secularism, this supposedly universal ideal? Is it less neutral than we might think?
Well, what's truly fascinating here is how the application of secularism, a concept, let's face it, drawn pretty directly from European history, is then extended globally and presented as this universal good. And this raises an important question. Does its perceived universality often overlook its specific historical and cultural roots?
Okay.
Sayyid argues that secularism, while definitely touted for its benefits, is deeply entwined with what he calls a narrative of Western exceptionality. In essence, it serves as a powerful marker of Western identity itself.
And a prime example of this critique that Sayyid uses is Indian secularism, isn't it? It's often held up as this successful non-Western model.
It is.
But what does he say about its actual lived reality?
He makes a pretty stark observation. While it's lauded globally, Indian secularism, in his view, coexists with an institutionalized system of communal violence.
Wow.
A system predominantly affecting Muslims. Sayyid suggests that this framework hasn't truly diffused the underlying tensions, but has maybe rendered it largely invisible.
So hiding the problem rather than solving it.
That's the critique. It highlights a disconnect between the ideal and the practical outcome on the ground.
That's a stark contrast to the usual narrative. And Sayyid goes further, doesn't he? Arguing that the assumption that religion has this unique capacity to incite hostility misses a larger point. What's that?
He argues that any claim to a higher authority, whether that's God or history with a capital H or science or even real, can legitimize positions beyond mundane objections. If you claim your stance is backed by ultimate truth, it makes it harder to just debate it normally.
Right, it shuts down discussion.
Exactly. And this, he says, can actually reproduce a kind of colonial dynamic where, say, the West embodies science and the non-West embodies superstition, even when the West is appealing to its own form of higher authority, like reason.
This also touches on distinct interpretations of the divine in Christological and Islamicate discourses. What's the key difference he highlights there?
Well, in Christological thought, he suggests the mundane and the divine often occupy the same ontological plane, the same fundamental level of existence, you could say.
Okay.
And this can at times lead to a perceived clash between scientific understanding and religious narratives. like they're competing for the same space.
So like when narratives of divine causality and human agency feel like they're locked in a zero-sum game, one has to give way to the other.
Precisely. In contrast, Sayyid highlights that Islamicate reflections consistently maintain a wide and permanent gap between the human and divine spheres.
The clear separation.
The very clear separation. This implies that science operates firmly within the realm of actual human reason, without ever questioning divine authority. The two aren't seen as being in competition because they occupy different realms entirely.
Fascinating. So, okay, having explored how identities are constructed relationally, Sayyid then pivots to show how these dynamics play out in the very nature of power itself. Let's talk about his crucial distinction between politics and the political.
Yes, this is absolutely fundamental to his argument. Politics, as he defines it, is a rule-governed activity.
Like a game.
Think of it exactly like a game. With opponents, you have clear rules, you try to win within them. It's about negotiation, compromise, established institution.
Okay, that's politics. And then there's the political, which sounds far more intense.
It is. The political describes something far more fundamental, more existential. It's a conflict that divides groups into truly antagonistic blocks.
Friend versus enemy.
Exactly. Where traditional rules and conventions can completely break down. It's not a specific domain of activity like economics or culture, but rather a condition that erupts when those fundamental distinctions between friends and enemies take hold. It's where the stakes feel incredibly high. Existential even.
And Sayyid details 3 methods a stable social order uses to try and master this political energy, to achieve what he calls depoliticization. How does the system try to keep the political in check?
Right. How do you tame it? First, there's domestication. That's where potential enemies are reduced to mere legislative opponents. They're still opponents, but now they play by the rules of the game.
Okay.
Second, there's what he calls cynical reason. This basically dismisses critiques as just cliches, making the social order seem immune to genuine challenge. Like, oh, we've heard that all before.
Right, deflating the criticism.
Exactly. And third, there's displacement. This is where antagonism is expelled to the exterior, pushed outside.
Creating outsiders.
Precisely. This is where you see the creation of those familiar civilization versus barbarism narratives, pushing the internal conflict outwards onto some external other.
And this, he argues, is often how Western identity constructs itself, by defining itself against an Oriental cultural formation.
That's a key part of his argument. Which brings us to a truly mischievous suggestion Sayyid makes about ancient Athens.
Oh, yeah. This was interesting. We often think of Athens as, the birthplace of democracy, freedom.
Cradle of Western civilization narratives.
Exactly. But he offers a different perspective, doesn't he? What's his playful rereading of Athenian history?
It's quite provocative. He suggests that perhaps it's just as useful to see in Athens the dawning of, totalitarianism.
Totalitarianism?
In Athens.
He points to it as a tightly disciplined society. A place where neighbors could be informers, prosecutors, juries, and judges, all rolled into one.
Wow, that really flips the script on how we often perceive Athens. So the birthplace of Western democracy. Sayyid suggests it could also be seen as an early model of intense social control. Precisely. The source argues that Athenian society, highly mobilized citizenry, relatively small, circumscribed area, it could produce a kind of small-town totalitarianism with this insistent pressure to conform. And then he contrasts this with the Persian Empire, which is often cast as the epitome of despotism.
Right, the big bad empire.
Yet Sayyid argues it employed a kind of multicultural strategy, ruling diverse groups through high levels of self-management, focusing on deference and tribute rather than, deep penetration into the communities themselves.
So less intrusive in some ways.
In some ways, yes. And this powerfully challenges that easy distinction between Greek freedom and Persian slavery, revealing it more as a historical narrative constructed later rather than a purely factual dichotomy at the time.
And this reevaluation brings us to the inherently political nature of Islam itself. Sayyid argues the Prophet Muhammad's mission wasn't just religious in a vacuum, but profoundly political from the outset. How so?
He argues it was inherently political because it fundamentally disrupted the existing social patterns in Makkah. It wasn't just about individual belief.
It changed the whole social structure.
Exactly. It inaugurated what he calls a new semantic order, creating new solidarities, Muslim versus non-Muslim, that deeply reconfigured existing tribal and social ties. It wasn't just a spiritual awakening. It was a societal upheaval with massive political implications.
Right. Okay, turning now towards reimagining the future, the book delves into the concept of the ummah, the global community of believers, as a fundamental Muslim attachment that, crucially, goes beyond mere national loyalty, or watan.
Yes, and the truly innovative idea here is viewing the Ummah as a kind of diaspora.
A diaspora? How does that work? It's not based on shared ancestry or leaving one homeland.
Not in the traditional sense. It's not based on common descent or a single point of origin, but rather conceived as a political formation that exists without a state.
Without a state.
Right. He describes it as seeping through the Westphalian edifice, the traditional system of nation-states with fixed borders.
So transcends borders.
It's a deterritorialized collective identity that inherently challenges the fixed boundaries of the modern nation-state system, especially in our current world of flows, migration, and communication.
And speaking of a world of flows, Sayyid summarizes 5 major effects of globalization that shape this contemporary landscape. Can you quickly run through those?
Sure. First, the rise of major cosmopolitan centers, think London, New York, Tokyo, global hubs.
Right.
Second, the emergence of a nascent global civil society, largely through NGOs and transnational activism. Third, the development of supranational formations, the EU, NAFTA, ASEAN, things like that. Fourth, the generalization of distant travel and migration becoming much more commonplace. And fifth, the increasing integration of the world political economy, mostly under neoliberal principles.
Okay. The critique he then levels is that the comforting vision of a common humanity that often accompanies globalization can be problematic. How so? What's the issue there?
He argues it's often conflated, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps not, with Western values. Leading to what he provocatively calls McWorld.
McWorld, okay.
Which sounds catchy, but the point is serious. It suggests this isn't about genuine pluralistic commonality. It's more an attempt to make the entire planet a home for one particular way of life, which starts to look a lot like cultural imperialism, just under a different name, a homogenization under a Western guise.
Right, that makes sense. The book then introduces the project of Islamic economics, which emerged particularly after the Cold War. It aimed to offer a distinct alternative, right, to both capitalism and communism.
Exactly. It was trying to carve out a third path.
What were its major claims? What was it offering?
It had 3 primary claims, broadly speaking. First, the absence of riba, or interest, was central, a rejection of what are seen as exploitative financial practices.
No interest.
Second, it positioned itself as a third way for achieving social equality, trying to avoid both the perceived excesses of capitalism and the authoritarianism sometimes associated with state socialism.
A balance.
A balance, yes. And third, it aimed for a more holistic sense of well-being, encompassing material and spiritual elements, going beyond just maximizing profit.
But as the book acknowledges, the practical implementation in many Muslim-majority countries, you mentioned Pakistan, Sudan, Iran, Malaysia, has often been quite piecemeal and, well, frankly, maybe disappointing.
Yeah, the results haven't always lived up to the initial aspirations. That's certainly true. However, Sayyid argues that the core idea remains valid.
Which is?
That all economic activity is culturally embedded. There's no such thing as a purely neutral economic system. Therefore, an Islamicate variant of the mixed economy remains conceptually plausible.
So just as other cultures have shaped their own versions of capitalism.
Exactly. Just as we see different flavors of capitalism around the world, he suggests there's no inherent reason why an Islamicate version couldn't genuinely exist and thrive, drawing on its own cultural and ethical frameworks.
This brings us to the perennial challenge of interpreting sacred texts. The Quran's polysemy, its capacity for multiple meanings, presents a significant interpretive challenge, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's not a straightforward legal code in many respects.
And the source outlines different approaches to this.
He does. He distinguishes between textualists who tend to see the Quran as autonomous and self-sufficient in its meaning.
The text is the text.
Pretty much.
Yes.
Then semi-textualists who agree on the centrality of the text but often interpret it through a more modern idiom or lens. And finally, contextualists who believe its meaning is significantly shaped by its historical and social context. You need to understand when and where it was revealed.
Right, the context matters deeply. And he raises an interesting problem. The danger of trying to access the mind of God, as it were, to determine divine intention. This can lead to what he calls spiritual positivism. What does he mean by that term?
Spiritual positivism. It's where scientific discourse is sort of unknowingly privileged over the divine.
How so? Give me an example.
Well, like trying to explain religious prohibition, say, the consumption of pork purely for health reasons discoverable by science.
Ah, okay. So finding a scientific justification for a divine command.
Exactly. Which sounds reasonable, but he argues it subtly reduces God's logic to something humanly discoverable, like scientific findings. It can lead to the divinization of science, where science inadvertently takes the place of ultimate authority.
I see.
The crucial point Sayyid makes is that the Quran cannot be reduced to just a legal code or a set of pillars for a constitution. It has to remain, in a sense, above the law.
Above the law.
Meaning it serves as a constant criterion, a transcendent standard for judging the justice of human laws and actions. It can't be fully captured or contained within human legal systems.
Absolutely. Okay, finally, let's explore how these ideas of decolonization play out in perhaps surprising places, like pop culture and global politics. Sayyid highlights how Western science fiction often, maybe unconsciously, colonizes the future.
Yeah, projecting forward the age of Europe, as he puts it, reflecting a kind of Western exceptionalism even in imagined futures.
And he uses an old Star Trek episode as an example.
He does. He points to the Omega Glory episode. In it, the Yang, who are clearly identified with the U.S., even down to a corrupted version of the Constitution.
Right, I remember that one.
They triumphed over the Calm, who are implicitly coded as communists or East Asians, and the narrative effectively restores the hierarchy of the West to the rest, even centuries in the future, out in space.
That's a clever observation. Applying that lens is fascinating. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, consider Sayyid's analysis of the recent Dune miniseries. Why does he think it's significant that Paul Atreides is presented primarily as a duke rather than the Mahdi?
That choice, the source argues, is profoundly significant. The title Duke immediately signals an established order, privilege, hierarchy. It's traditional Western leadership, perhaps reformed, but still rooted in that system.
Okay.
In contrast, the Mahdi, a figure central to the original books, represents something else entirely. A revolutionary, divinely guided figure who fundamentally disrupts all established values and hierarchies.
A complete game changer.
Exactly. So by emphasizing Duke over Mahdi, the series, in Sayyid's view, effectively reasserts Western hierarchy and established power structures. It contains the revolutionary potential. It opts for known privilege over potentially dangerous, transformative, non-Western change.
So if the centrality of the Mahdi were maintained, as in the book, it would turn Dune into a history of the future that breaks with conventional Western sci-fi.
That's the argument. It would allow Islam, or an Islamicate future, to be seen not just as a counter-history, something reacting to the West, but as potentially history itself, with a capital H, thereby reversing the ingrained colonial hierarchy.
Wow, that's a complete flip.
It is. And this discussion on, the reassertion of Western hierarchy leads us directly to Sayyid's take on the war on terror.
Right.
Which he describes pretty starkly as a dirty war waged globally. He argues it explicitly targets Muslimness, not just terrorists, but the very identity and Islamists, extending a logic previously seen in, say, Latin American counterinsurgency campaigns.
And it has, as Sayyid puts it, ripped the liberal democratic imaginary. That idea of Western power as fundamentally benign, what has this dirty war revealed about Western democracies, according to him?
Well, it's revealed what he calls the hollowing out of freedoms through practices we've all become familiar with. Force feeding at Guantanamo, drone strikes, mass surveillance. The very idea that reasoned argument and debate will be sufficient to resolve conflicts, which is kind of a cornerstone of the liberal democratic ideal,
right,
has, in his view, been cruelly exposed as insufficient, or at least easily discarded when the stakes are deemed high enough by those in power.
So this blurring of the friend-enemy distinction after formal decolonization, combined with the difficulty of traditional national liberation strategies, especially in urbanized settings, this has led to a fragmentation of Muslim resistance.
Yes, that's his analysis, often resulting in a kind of endemic violence. This violence, he observes, is sometimes detached from clear strategic goals. It can become viewed merely as acts of piety, disconnected from a larger political project aiming for concrete change.
So, given these incredibly complex, often bleak global dynamics, what does Sayyid propose as a more feasible path forward for Muslim agency, if not a traditional territorial state or caliphate?
He argues for establishing a global Islamicate counterpublic.
A counterpublic, what does that mean exactly?
It wouldn't be a state in the traditional sense, not defined by territory, but rather a transnational space, a network, a discourse operating in opposition to the dominant public sphere, the one often defined by the international community, as announced by Western powers.
So an alternative global conversation.
Essentially, yes. A space for articulating different values, different perspectives, different political possibilities. This, he believes, opens up the possibility of a truly multipolar global order, one underwritten not by a faux universalism.
That idea of Western values disguised as universal.
Exactly. But instead, underwritten by fundamental diversity, a genuine acceptance of different civilizational perspectives coexisting.
What an incredible journey through Sayyid's work. We've covered so much ground, from how identity and power are constructed, to the hidden ways social orders maintain stability, and these glimpses of potential alternative futures.
It's dense stuff, but really makes you think.
It really does. This material definitely challenges us, challenges you, to look beyond simplistic binaries, West versus Islam, secular versus religious, freedom versus despotism, and recognize the incredibly complex interplay of history, culture, and power in shaping our world. And that discussion about the political, it suggests that maybe transformation requires embracing or at least acknowledging spaces of antagonism and disruption, rather than just trying to smooth everything over or erase them entirely.
It's not comfortable, but maybe necessary.
So here's something to consider. How does understanding antagonism as potentially constitutive of identity, as part of how we define ourselves, not just a product of misunderstanding or malice, how does that change your perspective on conflict in the world? Does it open up any new possibilities for engagement or even transformation for you? Something to think about.